On the night of 26th May 2014, in the bush area of Eskdale Cemetery on Eskdale Road, Birkdale, Auckland, police search and rescue teams worked under artificial light. It was 2 days since 56-year-old Blessie Gotingco had failed to arrive home on Salisbury Road after catching the 973 bus from central Auckland. According to the initial missing person report, her adult daughter had noticed her absence at approximately 3:15 a.m., and her sons had called police around 3:30 a.m. on 25th of May. By late Monday night, officers had already collected her discarded belongings from a Birkdale street and canvassed nearby properties. A separate team had been analysing GPS data from an offender living in the area, subject to an electronically monitored curfew. That data pointed them repeatedly to this cemetery. In scrub off a track at Eskdale Cemetery, searchers located a woman's body. The scene was sealed, photographed, and logged. What began as a missing person inquiry had become a homicide investigation. On the morning of Saturday, 24th May 2014, Blessie Gotingco began what appeared to be a normal workday at Tower Insurance on Fanshawe Street in central Auckland. The 56-year-old Filipino immigrant had built a life in New Zealand with her husband Antonio and their 3 adult children. She was known to colleagues as reliable and hard-working, the kind of employee who stayed late when needed and maintained consistent routines. Phone records later obtained by investigators documented her movements that day with precision. At 6:21 p.m., she called her adult son to let him know she would be leaving the office around 7 p.m. and catching a bus home to Birkdale on Auckland's North Shore. It was a routine call, the kind families exchange without thinking, a small courtesy that would later anchor the entire investigative timeline. CCTV footage from Tower Insurance captured Blessie leaving the building at 6:53 p.m. The timestamp, logged automatically by the security system, showed her walking with apparent urgency out onto Fanshawe Street. She was heading toward the bus terminal on Lower Albert Street, following a route she had taken countless times before. Investigators would later log this footage as the last confirmed images of Blessie alive in the Auckland CBD. The timestamps were cross-checked against Birkenhead transport records for the 973 bus route, establishing the chronological baseline for everything that followed. At this point in the file, everything about 24th May still read like a normal Saturday shift in the city. The relevance of each timestamp would only emerge once she failed to come home. On the evening of 24th May 2014, bus company logs confirmed that Blessie boarded the Birkenhead Transport 973 service from Lower Albert Street, bound for Birkdale Road on Auckland's North Shore. The journey would take approximately 45 minutes through evening traffic, crossing the harbour bridge and winding through the suburban streets of the North Shore. Around dusk, Blessie alighted from the bus a few hundred metres from her home on Salisbury Road in Birkdale. Family members would later tell investigators that she found this final stretch of her commute uncomfortable due to poor street lighting, a routine concern that took on different significance in retrospect. Police reconstructed the journey using multiple data sources: ticket records from the bus company, timetable information, and cell site data from her mobile phone. The estimated time window when she was walking along Salisbury Road just before 8:40 p.m. would later become central to Crown allegations about what happened next. The 973 bus route was familiar territory for Blessie. The walk from the bus stop to her front door on Salisbury Road covered approximately 700 metres of suburban pavement. On any other evening, it would have taken her 10 to 15 minutes at a comfortable pace. In the first pass through the investigative file, this was simply a commute, office to bus to suburban road. On the second pass, that 700-metre stretch of Birkdale pavement became the first likely crime scene. the location where prosecutors would later allege she was deliberately struck by a vehicle. She stepped off the bus and headed up Salisbury Road. The next confirmed entry in the record would not be a sighting. It would be a missing person report. In the early hours of Sunday, 25 May 2014, Blessie's adult daughter arrived home to Salisbury Road at approximately 3:15 a.m. and immediately noticed her mother was not there. The house was quiet. Blessie's bedroom was empty. There was no indication she had returned home at all that evening. After checking with her brothers and confirming that none of them had heard from their mother since her phone call earlier that day, the family contacted New Zealand police around 3:30 a.m. The initial County log, the computer-aided dispatch record that documents every police call, time-stamped the report and triggered the first response protocols. The case opened as a high-risk missing person inquiry. Standard risk assessment factors elevated the priority. Blessie's age, her gender, her uncharacteristic failure to return home, and the absence of any communication since her 6:21 p.m. phone call to her son. This was not someone who disappeared without notice. Detectives began immediate canvassing. They confirmed with Tower Insurance that Blessie had not returned to work on Sunday, ruling out any possibility she had gone back to the office for some reason. They contacted Birkenhead Transport to verify she had boarded the 973 bus. They initiated door-to-door inquiries on Salisbury Road and neighbouring streets, asking residents if anyone had seen her walking home the previous evening. Viewed strictly through the documents, the transition was clear. In approximately 8 hours, the file moved from a normal Saturday commute to an unexplained overnight absence, triggering formal police protocols. By mid-morning, officers would find items on the road that suggested something more than a missed bus. On 25 May 2014, as daylight returned to Birkdale, search teams fanned out across the area where Blessie should have walked home. The systematic grid search of streets, verges, and nearby properties followed standard missing person protocols for a high-risk case. That morning, officers located items identified as Blessie's belongings on or near Salisbury Road. The specific items and their exact positions were documented in scene logs, personal effects that should have been with her, now scattered on a suburban street. Detective Senior Sergeant Stan Brown of North Shore CIB addressed media later that day. The circumstances around the disappearance, he told reporters, were of concern. There was nothing at the scene to indicate a simple fall or accident. The evidence suggested something else entirely. The recovery of personal items triggered immediate escalation. Cordons were erected around sections of Salisbury Road. Scene of crime officers began forensic mapping of the area, photographing and bagging each item with precise location markers. Requests went out for CCTV footage from nearby intersections, commercial properties, and residential security systems. Investigators now treated Salisbury Road as a suspected crime scene, rather than simply a point on a missing person route. The distinction was significant. Different protocols applied, different resources were allocated, and the investigative mindset shifted from finding a missing woman to understanding what had happened to her. In the paperwork, the items on Salisbury Road were the first physical markers that ordinary routine had been interrupted by likely criminal action. While one team logged every item on the roadside, another started examining who else had been on Salisbury Road that night, including one monitored offender who had recently moved into the area. On 26 May 2014, a separate investigative thread converged with the Salisbury Road scene. Analysts had been examining GPS data from an offender living near the disappearance site, a man subject to an 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew, enforced by an electronic monitoring anklet as part of his post-release conditions from prison. GPS expert Dr. Donaldson, who would later testify at trial, plotted the data from the monitoring device. The results showed a clear pattern. The wearer had been at or near Eskdale Cemetery on Eskdale Road on the evening of 24th May, the same evening Blessie disappeared. The data also showed a return to the cemetery at approximately 6:18 a.m. the following morning, with a return home recorded at 6:44 a.m. The correlation was immediate and specific. An offender under electronic supervision had visited a cemetery in the early morning hours after a woman went missing less than 2 kilometers away. Search and rescue officers were directed to Eskdale Cemetery based on the GPS coordinates. The cemetery, a quiet burial ground bordered by bush and scrub on Eskdale Road, became the focus of an intensive physical search. Later that day, 26th of May 2014, searchers located a woman's body under scrub in the cemetery grounds. The remains were partially concealed in vegetation off one of the cemetery tracks. The scene was immediately secured, photographed, and logged as a body recovery site. The GPS anklet, originally imposed as a supervisory tool to monitor an offender's compliance with curfew conditions, had become the key pointer from a suburban street to the exact location where the body was found. Once investigators knew where the offender's device had traveled, the next question was clear. What was he doing in that cemetery? Twice? In the early hours of Tuesday, 27th of May 2014, police arrested a 27-year-old man at an apartment complex in Birkdale, located a short distance from Salisbury Road. The arrest was coordinated and swift, conducted by officers who had spent the previous 48 hours building a case file that now pointed directly to this address. Media reports would later identify the man as Tony Douglas Robertson. He was already known to authorities, not as a person of casual interest, but as someone with a documented history of serious violent and sexual offending. Court records from 4 October 2006 detailed his prior convictions: abducting and indecently assaulting a child in Tauranga, along with related offences. He had served an 8-year sentence and been released in December 2013, just 5 months before Blessie's disappearance. An extended supervision order had been imposed in February 2014, but it had not yet taken effect when the crime occurred. The GPS anklet monitoring his movements was part of his release conditions, a supervision mechanism that tracked where he went but could not prevent what he did. Officers executed search warrants at his residence, seizing his silver BMW, electronic devices, clothing, and bedding. The vehicle was transported for forensic examination, with investigators focusing on damage patterns consistent with striking a pedestrian and any biological traces that might link the car to the victim. The GPS anklet data confirmed what investigators already suspected. Robertson's monitored movements correlated with both Salisbury Road on the evening of 24th May and Eskdale Cemetery in the hours that followed. Within 3 days of the initial missing person report, the investigation file contained a body, a suspect with significant prior convictions, and an electronic trail linking him to both alleged crime scenes. In late May 2014, a forensic pathologist conducted a post-mortem examination on the body recovered from Eskdale Cemetery. The findings, later presented as evidence during the April-May 2015 trial, documented a sequence of injuries that revealed not just how Blessie Gotingco died, but the order in which violence had been inflicted upon her. The body showed injuries consistent with being struck by a vehicle, trauma patterns that matched the mechanics of a pedestrian impact. But the vehicle strike had not killed her. Additional examination revealed evidence of strangulation, compression injuries to the neck, indicating manual force applied with lethal intent. There was more. Multiple stab wounds were documented across her body, inflicted before death. A T-shirt found around her neck, originally white, was saturated with blood. The forensic evidence also indicated sexual assault. The pathologist's findings supported what would become the Crown's theory of sequence. Blessie had been struck by a car on Salisbury Road, abducted while incapacitated, sexually assaulted, strangled, and stabbed multiple times before her body was transported to Eskdale Cemetery and concealed in the bush. For investigators, the autopsy did not provide motive. It provided order, a medically supported timeline of injuries that could now be mapped against vehicle damage, GPS records, and DNA evidence. Each wound told part of the story. Together they formed a continuous sequence of offending that connected Salisbury Road to the cemetery. The post-mortem report became a central exhibit, transforming what might have appeared as separate incidents into a single documented chain of criminal acts. With the medical sequence established, attention turned to matching that timeline against one man's documented movements and one silver BMW. In late May and June 2014, forensic examination of Tony Robertson's silver BMW became central to the physical evidence chain. Investigators focused on front-end damage patterns, paint transfer, and biological traces that might connect the vehicle to both Salisbury Road and the injuries documented in the post-mortem examination. Scene reports from Salisbury Road had already documented tire marks, debris, and blood-staining patterns on the roadway. Collision reconstruction experts compared these against the BMW's damage profile, building a physical narrative of impact. Swabs collected from the vehicle's interior and exterior were processed for DNA and blood pattern analysis. The results, presented later in court, supported the Crown's allegation that the car had been used to strike Blessie and then transport her body. Trace evidence matched samples recovered from her remains. At Eskdale Cemetery, forensic examination extended beyond the burial site itself. A forensic expert would later testify that blood traces and items recovered from the scene, including a piece of seatbelt and sponge material, indicated the body had been dragged through long grass and bush from where the vehicle likely stopped to where she was concealed. Physically, the investigation file now linked 3 locations through matching traces: Salisbury Road, the BMW, and Eskdale Cemetery. Procedurally, it gave the Crown a continuous physical pathway for the jury to follow, from suburban street to vehicle interior to remote burial site. The physical traces were compelling, but in modern investigations, the most decisive evidence trails are often digital. By early 2015, laboratory reports summarized the DNA testing that would become pivotal at trial. A forensic scientist testified in the High Court that DNA found inside Blessie's body was 10,000 million times more likely to be from the accused than from a random person in the population. The statistical weight was overwhelming. The defense challenged this evidence on transfer grounds. Another expert acknowledged it was theoretically possible for semen to have been transferred from a bedsheet Blessie's body was wrapped in, a scenario the defense raised to introduce doubt about direct contact. The jury would ultimately weigh both interpretations. Simultaneously, investigators compiled a comprehensive digital timeline of Robertson's movements using multiple data sources. The GPS logs from his monitoring anklet provided the primary track, but phone records and other electronic data filled gaps and corroborated locations. Dr. Donaldson's expert analysis plotted this data visually for the court, showing movement from Robertson's residence to Salisbury Road to Eskdale Cemetery and back. The defense challenged GPS accuracy, noting margins of error that could place the device meters away from its recorded position. Prosecutors countered that even accounting for error margins, the pattern remained consistent. Robertson was in the relevant locations at the relevant times. In procedural terms, this phase of the investigation moved the case from circumstantial reconstruction toward high probability attribution. DNA placed biological evidence inside the victim. GPS placed the suspect at both crime scenes. Together, They formed the evidentiary core of the prosecution. In April 2015, the trial of the 28-year-old man accused of raping and murdering Blessie Gotingco began in the High Court at Auckland. Justice Brewer presided over proceedings before a jury of 7 women and 5 men. Name suppression for the accused remained in place at this stage of the trial. Crown Prosecutor Kieran Raftery opened by outlining the timeline that investigators had painstakingly constructed. From CCTV at Tower Insurance showing Blessie leaving work, to the 973 bus, to Salisbury Road, to the silver BMW, to the Birkdale apartment, and finally to Eskdale Cemetery. Each step was anchored by GPS coordinates, forensic evidence, or documented records. "The evidence is the only voice she's got in this trial," Raftery told the jury, a statement that framed the prosecution's approach. Blessie could not testify to what happened. The physical and digital evidence would speak for her. The defense, assisted by counsel, acting as amicus for the self-represented accused, focused on challenging the reliability of key evidence. GPS data accuracy was questioned. Alternative explanations for semen transfer were proposed. The defense argued that the evidence, while substantial, did not exclude reasonable doubt. What had begun as scattered logs, reports, and forensic samples was now organized into competing narratives presented under oath and subject to cross-examination. The jury's task was to determine which narrative the evidence supported. By 22nd of May 2015, after several weeks of testimony, expert evidence, and legal argument, Justice Brewer completed his summing up, and the jury retired to consider verdicts on charges of rape and murder. The deliberations weighed the accumulated evidence: CCTV timestamps, bus company records, GPS tracking data, forensic pathology findings, DNA analysis, vehicle examination results, and the physical traces connecting 3 crime scenes. The defense challenges to GPS accuracy and the theoretical possibility of semen transfer were considered against the statistical weight of the DNA evidence and the consistent pattern of the accused's documented movements. The jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts. Following the verdicts, suppression orders were lifted, and media were permitted to name Tony Douglas Robertson as the convicted offender. The public now learned what investigators had known since late May 2014. The man responsible for Blessie Gotingco's death had been living in her neighborhood, under electronic monitoring. With a documented history of serious violent and sexual offending against children. Justice Brewer remarked on the strength of the evidence and the brutality of the offending. The court record noted that Robertson's prior child abduction convictions were revealed to the jury only after verdicts were returned, to avoid prejudicing their deliberations. Procedurally, the case transitioned from investigation and fact-finding to sentencing and systemic questions about how a known high-risk offender had been in a position to commit this crime. On 6th August 2015, in the High Court at Auckland, Justice Brewer delivered sentence. Tony Douglas Robertson received life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 24 years for murder. For the rape conviction, he received preventive detention with a minimum period of 10 years, a sentence designed specifically for offenders deemed too dangerous for eventual release without ongoing parole board oversight. Justice Brewer described the offending as bestial. The sentencing remarks documented the aggravating factors, the predatory nature of the attack, the vulnerability of the victim, the sexual violence, and the calculated attempts to conceal the crime. The court record and subsequent government inquiry detailed Robertson's history. In October 2006, he had received an 8-year sentence for abducting and indecently assaulting a child in Tauranga. He served the full term, releasing in December 2013 without parole, meaning no gradual reintegration, no supervised transition. An extended supervision order was imposed in Ut sentencing. The GPS anklet appeared in the record in a new light. It was not only the device that led police to the body, it was also the symbol of a supervision regime that could monitor movements, but could not prevent the crime itself. The criminal case was closed, but a parallel file was opening, an inquiry into whether the systems around Robertson had worked as intended. In 2016, the government inquiry into the management of Tony Douglas Robertson before and after his release published its findings. The inquiry examined corrections handling of a known high-risk offender, the timing and implementation of supervision orders, and the effectiveness of electronic monitoring as a public safety tool. The report concluded that while there were areas for improvement, police and corrections had carried out a difficult task well. No agency failures were formally identified as contributing to Blessie's death. Only Robertson himself, the inquiry determined, was directly responsible. Blessie's husband, Antonio Gotingco, responded publicly. He was disappointed and devastated by the finding that no systemic failures had occurred. Corrections, ineptitude, he argued, had contributed to his wife's death. The family's grief was compounded by a conclusion that seemed to absolve the institutions that had been monitoring their daughter's killer. The inquiry detailed Robertson's prison behavior, his limited engagement with psychological treatment programs, and the decision to release him at sentence end with conditions rather than seeking preventive detention in 2006. It noted that GPS monitoring had successfully guided police to the cemetery, demonstrating that supervision tools function as detection mechanisms rather than prevention systems. The documentary record closes with two enduring images: a suburban bus stop on Birkdale Road, where a routine commute ended, and a GPS route line curving through a North Shore cemetery, where searchers followed an electronic signal to a burial site. Together, they mark the distance between ordinary life and lethal risk, a distance measured in this case entirely by documented evidence.